morning, ladies and gentlemen, and dear non-binary people. This is something I read over Christmas and liked it, so yeah, welcome everybody. This is the new year and we still have 3 more weeks to go. This is week 11 of the introduction to the culture of the 19th century, and today I'd like to talk with you about Victorian art. There is an entire course in the Institute devoted to the kind of overview, historical overview of British art, and it has a few weeks devoted to the study of Victorian art. Of course, you're very welcome to enroll to this course if you're interested in painting, in architecture, and you would like to know more also beyond the scope of the 19th century, earlier and later. But I decided to have 1 week about British art because British art of the Victorian period is very good material to study general culture and society and history of the 19th century. For a few general reasons. One is that art, mainly painting, was their most important visual medium. Photography was only beginning. It would be very interesting to study the beginnings of the technology of photography and the art of photography, and there are many interesting artists, also women like Julia Margaret Cameron, for example. But apart from that, paintings were the most important visual medium for the Victorians. They were very popular. Some scholars, Jeremy Paxman, I'll talk about him in a moment, called them the cinema of the Victorian period because they were well known. They were shown during exhibitions that were visited by sometimes many thousands of viewers. They would be reproduced in forms of prints, so you could buy a cheaper, smaller version to own, to hang on your own wall. So it wasn't an exclusive art relegated to the palaces of the very rich and the museums. It was something that many people were interested in. Another thing is that the education of artists and the way that patronage worked changed greatly since the second half of the 18th century. In the 18th century, the Royal Academy of Arts was established, which became the most important artistic institution. And if you were talented, if you wanted to become an artist, you would go there. You would basically become a student at the Royal Academy of Arts, rather than use the old way, that is, become an apprentice to an established master. This system proved to be very effective. It was usually highly praised by the Victorian establishment themselves. Many artists, actually most of the successful artists of the age, were somehow involved with the Royal Academy, either as students or as members. So an established practicing artist could become a member of the Royal Academy, first an associate, then a full member, which meant he joined like the trade union of painters and could get better commissions. Some of the artists, especially the Pre-Raphaelites that we are going to talk about slightly later today, rebelled against the rules of the Royal Academy. And generally, the concept of the academic art is connected with the 19th century and the 19th century views on art in general. So first of all, the education, the training of artists, which was mostly concerned with teaching them the subjects to illustrate, to represent, rather than the techniques themselves. It was more or less taken for granted that each artist should be able to master the realistic technique. But the value, the ascribed value of art was more or less dependent on the choice of the subjects rather than the technical mastery. And of course there are many subjects that are important to the Victorians, from the very high subjects that would get the best commissions, that would be executed in largest formats as well. So the highest subjects were, of course, classical mythology, Christian religion, and the next two of those high subjects were history and literature. So we have a lot of illustrative art referring to all kinds of historical references, texts of culture, the historical events and characters, mythology and mythological events and characters that were important to the Victorians. So what we have is the illustrations of classical mythology, the illustrations of history, especially national history, so British history, also the moments in history referring, for example, to the colonial expansion. We have a lot of literary illustrations, of course, first of all, of the works of William Shakespeare, who by the time of the 19th century has really been regarded as the national bard, like the second Bible, basically. So you'll see some examples in a little moment. What is important is that the vast majority of art in the 19th century, and definitely the academic art, is realistic. So these paintings show realistic images of people, places. Sometimes they go very far in their realism, especially the paintings inspired by history. They are almost antiquarian. Many artists would actually go to museums and study historical artifacts so they could represent the historical periods they chose to illustrate very realistically. Another reason why Victorian art is such good material for cultural studies is the great popularity of the so-called middle brow art, or the genre paintings. The genre paintings, sometimes also called the narrative paintings, were the paintings that showed realistic scenes of contemporary modern life. Very often they referred to daily lives and daily problems of the people. It could be the fashionable people from the rich sections of the society. It could be the royal family, of course, as well. It could be very often the middle class, and we have a lot of paintings that show the daily life of the middle classes, especially women. Well, artists have always been interested in the beauty of women, and we have a lot of portraiture, we have a lot of images showing Victorian women going about their daily business. So we have quite a lot of paintings that actually show the realistic images of Victorian life. We have many paintings that show the life of the poor people. Many artists wanted to raise the social conscience, to incline the viewers to be more charitable towards the poor, to be more understanding. So we have many Victorian paintings showing the lives of the servants, the lives of the poor in the city, even the lives of the people from the margins of the society, such as the fallen woman. That is the Victorian word for a prostitute. So, surprise, surprise, it is quite a frequent subject in Victorian painting, and almost always these women are shown in a very sympathetic light as victims of the situation, victims of the circumstances of their lives, rather than immoral women who are to be blamed for their poverty, for their profession, for their fallenness, to use the Victorian word. So, British culture of the 19th century can very interestingly be observed through the art of the Victorians. And this is something I wanted to show you. This is a book published by the BBC, which is the book accompanying a BBC documentary miniseries called The Victorians, made by Jeremy Paxman, one of the quite prolific historians dealing with the period. So if you could find the documentary, this is a very good idea, because he exactly treats Victorian art in a way that I have just described, as illustration of Victorian culture. The title is The Victorians. There were 4 episodes. The book, if you ever go to the Institute these days, the book can be found in the British Studies Centre library. So you might want to browse through it and learn some more, to see the illustrations for yourselves. So I guess it's a good idea to look at some examples. Perhaps let's start with the less typical examples that go beyond the realistic images most typical for the academic style in art. So, for example, the large oeuvre, so the body of work by Joseph Mallord William Turner. Actually, nowadays he is perceived as one of the best Victorian painters, one of the best British painters ever. He died in the middle of the 19th century, but in fact his appreciation increased dramatically after his death. He wasn't very popular during his lifetime, and definitely his art was considered too unorthodox and too strange, and nowadays you might call it modern, for the majority of Victorians, for the mainstream Victorian art viewing world to appreciate it, really. We have one example here called Rain, Steam and Speed from 1844, which tackles a very important Victorian subject, but in a rather untypical way. The subject is modernity, the subject is technological progress, but if you look at the painting itself, it is very stylized. It is not realistic. You can hopefully see that the main subject here is a train crossing a bridge in the rain and fog. So you can see the bridge, you can see the very black figure of the train approaching, but it's not very realistic. In fact, Turner has been associated by later art historians with the Impressionists, although the Impressionists were at least one generation later, and their ideals, their purpose to use those experimental techniques were different than in the case of Turner, because Turner wanted to show ideas, to show the kind of perception of reality rather than the realistic images of reality. So if you look closely, or if you Google this title and see a better resolution picture, you can see that there's quite a lot of things going on here. There is another bridge in the distance, something that looks much older, more traditional. There is a river. There are even some small human figures. There is a farmer plowing a field. There are some people dancing in a circle next to the bank of the river, but you really have to look close to find these examples, these images. So what we have is a very powerful, emotional image of modernity, of the new technology that can be at the same time scary and perhaps also fascinating. The very idea that you can move at great speed and this huge machine like approaching right out of the painting is very modern. But if you want to know about Turner, go ahead. Of course, I strongly invite you to enroll to the course about British art. But he's not really typical Victorian art, even though now he is one of the most popular 19th century artists. Another one would be John Constable, who mostly specialized in peaceful landscapes of Suffolk, so the area where he grew up. Another image I'd like to show you as an example of something that's not very typical but still quite visible in Victorian art is the fantasy paintings, the paintings that show the fantasy world. And we have here a painting called The Fairy Feller Masterstroke by Richard Dadd, also from the middle of the 19th century, and it shows again a mass of small figures, and if you look very close you can start to discern individual figures which are supposed to represent fairies. Fairies such as you might find in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream perhaps, or the kind of legendary mythological creatures that some people believed really existed. For example, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle actually believed that fairies existed. So here we have an artist depicting the world of his imagination. So the world of the fairies. They actually look like tiny creatures seen under the microscope or under the magnifying glass. if you know anything about the life of the artist, it was quite tragic. He went insane and spent a large portion of his life in an insane asylum. So perhaps this also illustrates the threat of madness that for very many Victorians was one of the major scares of their lives. So here we have perhaps two types of art that are Victorian but are not the most typical, and let us now move to those typical ones. So perhaps let's start with history, mythology, literature, and religion. Perhaps we'll return to religion when we talk about the Pre-Raphaelites, because they were inspired by Christianity quite a lot. But if we look at literary and ancient inspirations, there are quite a lot of such images in Victorian art, especially in the last quarter of the 19th century and then the turn of the century. We have, if you remember from our discussion of Victorian fashion, in the later 70s and in the 80s, there is a moment which is characterized by a renewed interest in classical antiquity. It is visible in the fashion, it is visible in the general interest and in graphic arts as well. And I would like to show you two examples here. One, both by well-established academic artists, that illustrate this later Victorian neoclassicism. So one by Frederick Lord Leighton and another by Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema. So let's start with Leighton's The Return of Persephone. So actually painting classical scenes was a good excuse for many artists to include nudes, to include naked bodies in their art. I haven't chosen any nude paintings, but there are quite a lot of them in later Victorian period. This one actually illustrates a well-known tale from Greek mythology about Demeter and Persephone. I hope you are familiar with the story. Demeter was the goddess of vegetation, the goddess of plants and nature, and Persephone was her daughter, who was abducted to the underworld by the god of the underworld, the god of death, Hades. He fell in love with her and kidnapped her to marry her and make her his queen. Demeter was in great despair, so nature and the vegetation started to die down. So the gods decided, the council of the gods decided that Persephone should be returned to her mother, at least for some part of the year, and the remaining part of the year she could spend with her husband in the underworld. And here we have the moment when Persephone is returned from the underworld. The third character here is the god Hermes, the messenger of the gods, who accompanies Persephone in her journey from the underworld to the arms of her mother. And here we have a very well executed painting with the figures of the gods and the clothes that are, from what we may see, quite well executed images of classical attire. But if you compare any real ancient illustrations of this myth, actually they never show this scene. They never show the return of Persephone. They show either the abduction itself or Persephone and Hades as king and queen of the underworld, seated on their throne and judging the mortals. So what we have here is at the same time an illustration of a classical myth and an illustration of Victorian morality. There was, some years ago, there was a big exhibition of those late Victorian neoclassical paintings, and the title was The Victorians in Togas. Because these are not real ancient gods. These are the Victorians wearing togas. These are images that at the same time show Victorian morality, Victorian values. Like here, they show the great respect and admiration for motherhood. So the moment when the mother goddess welcomes her child into her arms, who is like a very pale little plant going from beneath the earth. It's at the same time neoclassical, at the same time referring to ancient mythology, but glorifying something that was extremely important to the Victorians themselves. That is family values and maternity. And we continue in a moment with more.